Let's compare the 4 healers of Final Fantasy XIV. If you already know you want to main a healer, then this might serve to help you choose, or alternatively teach you what you don't want. Or maybe you just want to hear about the pros and cons of each healer combined with a bit of comedy, in which case you have also come to the right place. Please keep in mind that this video may be slightly opinionated, especially in the ratings shown for each job. So, if you feel that I missed something or that you disagree, I would love to hear about it or about your favorite healer in the comments. Before we start, healers, more so than other roles, have a lot of overlap in their most basic toolkits. Namely, they all have a 1.5 second cast time single target attack, they all have an instant cast dot, and they all have a simple single target heal. Naturally, in this comparison, we care mostly about the differences in how the rest of their toolkits play. Another important distinction between healers is that 2 of them are pure healers and 2 of them are barrier healers, so we will compare them in these pairs. What signifies a pure healer is that it primarily performs its healing through powerful direct healing and heal over time components, although it will still have limited access to barriers. A barrier healer, on the other hand, is signified by having access to passive healing, meaning some sort of automatically applied healing that requires little to no effort from the healer itself to deliver. Additionally, barrier healers have far more readily available access to barriers and weirdly has access to a few heal over time effects despite it being intended to be the pure healer's signature. Now then, let's begin with the White Mage, the classic holy magic healer. Not the nature magic healer really anymore, apparently. As the first pure healer, the White Mage's performance is very dependent on the user's input. You have to apply that regen to keep the tank alive. You have to do all the damage you get credit for, no raid buffs. And the reward for this extreme personal responsibility is that you both have a better overview of what is going out, since it is whatever you do. And the White Mage has absolutely incredible healing potential, as well as excellent personal damage output. In terms of attack rotation, the unique features of the White Mage is that instead of having a reliable instant filler attack, the White Mage has access to the healing gauge, which is more important for healing really, but these are spent with instant cast heals that also nourishes the Blood Lily. When nourished 3 times, you can cast Afflatus Misery, which has become a signature attack of the White Mage, which has one of the highest potencies for a single attack in the game. Essentially, this means in a prolonged fight, the White Mage may want to plan their healing with the Lily spells around times when they have to move anyway, meaning that casting Glare was not even an option in the first place. And then, the difficult part is deciding whether you use Afflatus Misery for the mobility option or you use it with raid cooldowns, which is recommended of course. Additionally, the White Mage can be expected to cast significantly more of their basic attack spell Glare than other healers due to the presence of Mind, giving a large casting speed boost for the raid cooldown windows. In area of effect fights, the White Mage uniquely is the one healer with a 2.5 cast time attack in Holy, which also awkwardly does the second least amount of damage amongst the healers. Holy also presents a defensive component in stunning all enemies hit due to diminishing returns, allowing the White Mage to stun a pack of enemies for around 7 seconds in every fight. This also presents another concern for White Mages in area of effect encounters, as while moving, your only real option is applying damage over time effects or casting lilies and preparing the Blood Lily alongside tossing out Assay's. And even if you could cast Holy, you would prefer to wait until all of the enemies are piled up before doing so. Now that was a lot of talk about attacks for a healer. Let's talk about healing. The White Mage brings to the table many of the most reliable and powerful healing tools in the game, including Benediction, the complete full heal. With Plenary Indulgence, the White Mage is also capable of doing over 2000 potency worth of healing to an entire raid within 10 seconds, while moving. However, the main downfalls of the White Mage is their limited MP management tools compared to other healers, and how heavily their healing potential is funneled into their spells and not their abilities. For MP management, the White Mage has to use Assay's on cooldown, which does do damage, and healing. Assay's does pretty much everything, but beyond that, the only other option is Thin Air. which makes your next spell free. The helpfulness of Thin Air is entirely dependent on whether you need to cast an expensive spell or not. If a lot of party members die throughout a fight, then Thin Air is a clean 2400 MP. If no massive amount of healing is needed, Thin Air is 400 MP. In a dungeon environment, the run from fight to fight leaves an opening for the White Mage to apply regen to the tank before the fight really begins. But beyond this, White Mages pair much better with tanks that have a lot of self-sustained healing, as otherwise the White Mage may be forced to stop attacking in AoE pools to manually heal the tank, which is undesirable. On the other hand, in a raid environment, the White Mage's incredible healing potential can compensate for an inexperienced co-healer much better than most other healers can. And due to the much more common raid-wide damage in such an environment, tools like Asai's becomes a lot more helpful. Not to mention Liturgy of the Bell. The flower can in certain situations perform that 2000 potency healing all on its own when used wisely. An interesting detail about the White Mage's toolkit is that, despite being a pure healer, it has the capability to apply 1000 potency worth of single target shields through Divine Benison, which is typically more than what barrier healers will apply reliably through their spells. Next, let's talk about the other pure healer, Astrologian. The ultimate support job, playing the aesthetic of a fortune teller using a combination of space and time magic alongside tarot cards. The Astrologian is completely opposite to the White Mage in terms of how their damage potential is delivered. The Astrologian does the least damage personally amongst the healers, but simultaneously has the largest amount of buffs for their raid. In fact, optimizing the damage of the Astrologian involves a lot of knowing how other jobs function in terms of burst. Since you bring a powerful raid-wide 2-minute cooldown to the raid, you yourself have a vested interest in optimizing around it. This is done by trying to play 3 cards in quick succession around the time divination is available. And because you get 4 cards over 2 minutes, this means that you need to know which job in your raid benefits the most from the bonus card you get on odd minutes. Similarly, when playing those 3 cards in quick succession, you need to consider who benefits the most from each card you draw, since this can also change. Fortunately, the personal buff Astrodyne given to you from playing the cards can be optimized to be used around the 2-minute bursts in some capacity too. Finally, for AoE, the Astrologian is the only healer who has the option to cast their AoE at range. And for mobility, the Astrologian has access to light speed to cast and run for a bit. However, this typically ends up being used for the 2-minute card burst. This means that outside of this 2-minute burst, the Astrologian does have a lot of space for their healing toolkit. And while the lower damage potential of the Astrologian itself might make you think that you need to worry less about attacking, this is of course not the case, as all damage done is more than no damage. The Astrologian has access to more different tools to heal with abilities than the White Mage, and a lot of them are weirdly multi-purpose in nature. Exaltation both reduces the incoming damage for a bit and then applies a heal after the fact. Collective Unconscious is a channeled, rarely used for this, damage reduction dome that also applies a heal over time to everyone within. And similar to White Mage, the Astrologian also has 2 charges of an ability that applies shields in Celestial Intersection, putting you in the awkward position of wanting to apply a shield to your tank, but preferably only after they have already taken damage. The toolkit of the Astrologian being a little strange does not mean that it is bad by any means, but simply means that the skill requirement to make the most of your toolkit may be significantly higher than for, say, White Mage, both for attacking and healing. In a dungeon environment, the Astrologian has the advantage of having more downtime to draw extra cards. Planning the downtime to be the time where your big cooldowns can ready again can be massively helpful. The more problematic parts is that in a dungeon context, you are much more likely to not have both a melee and a ranged, causing your card play to be more problematic in some ways. However, the main concern in a dungeon environment is to find the best way to make use of your toolkit to heal the tank. Similarly to the White Mage, being able to apply a heal over time before fighting can be useful, and light speed can make it easier for you to attack while on the move with gravity. Regardless of your environment, dungeon or raid, some of the biggest difficulties I imagine will be planning around use of horoscope, macrocosmos and earthly star. Should these provide a lot of difficulty though, Astrologian happens to have the most powerful job-specific MP management tools in Astrodyne and Draw, allowing you to depend more on the expensive heals if needed. An interesting aspect of the Astrologian is its neutral sect, during which the Astrologian's aspected spells, in addition to the heal over time components, also apply shields nearly as big as those provided by Scholar and Sage, temporarily making the Astrologian both a pure and a barrier healer, you could say. Speaking of barrier healers, let's talk about Scholar, the pet healer job. The inspiring playstyle of the Scholar being that the fairy performs the majority of the healing needed to be done, and the Scholar simply assists when necessary. Which is why some of the bigger heals the Scholar provides are more intended to supplement or shield allies to give the fairy time to do its thing. In terms of attacking, the Scholar, in addition to the basics, has access to a weaker but always available instant attack to use on the move, as well as the strongest AoE attack, which also happens to be instant, giving the Scholar a lot of mobility when it needs it. In addition to this, the Scholar also provides a raid-wide buff, overall ever so slightly weaker than the Astrologians, but powerful nonetheless. More awkwardly though, the Scholar is also provided with a way to spend its healing resources for additional damage, which merges together with such a raid cooldown to cause the quote-unquote optimal way to maximize damage to involve dumping all of your ether flow into attacking, and even temporarily sacrificing your fairy for even more damage, which can sometimes cause problems since barrier healers tend to require this secondary resource to pay for a majority of their healing cooldowns. For most content, and most scholars in general, this kind of strategy is wholly unnecessary however, so do not worry. In terms of healing, the Scholar's deployment tactics allows them to apply the biggest shields in the game with no competition if planned correctly, either with a lucky critical hit with Adloquium or with a recited one. Additionally, if you choose to use your ether flows for healing rather than damage, then for a majority of content, the combination of well-placed sacred soils and excogitations, combined with your fairy's abilities, can be just enough to deal with anything thrown at you. And with the range and reactiveness of your fairy, you don't need to micromanage it much. However, simply placing your fairy in the center of the fight taking place can sometimes help it be just a little faster at doing its thing. Simply put, while you have a vast toolkit with a handful of strange abilities, if you choose to use your ether flow for defensive purposes, you have access to some tools so powerful you may not even need to think about your healing spells at all. In fact, in a dungeon environment, the Scholar can often literally depend on just excogitation and sacred soil and a pet ability or two for every pack, and just go ham slapping the floor with that art of war. Not to mention that Scholar is the only job in Final Fantasy XIV with a raid-wide speed boost that works in combat, with Expedient making it the perfect healer for speedrunning dungeons. In a raid context, it becomes more complex since the amount of ether flow you can invest in attacking partly depends on how much healing your co-healer provides. Usually, this can come naturally, as if ether flow becomes ready again without you needing to spend the resources, you get the damage. As it stands right now, Scholar, because of this weird interaction that it can sacrifice healing to do damage, is the strongest amongst the healers for damage in a raid context. And if the pet management worries you, keep in mind that the single target tools of the Fairy and the Seraph have 30 yalms of range, and most of the AoE tools have at least 15 yalms of radius. And that most boss arenas aren't much more than 20 yalms of radius, so placing the pet in the center of the arena often is all you need to do. And finally, the newest barrier healer, Sage, working with a lot of similar tools to the Scholar, to the point of almost being disturbing, with a techie aesthetic that includes a mostly blue or red color on everything they do, drastically different from the other healers that somewhat agree on a green color scheme. The Sage replaces the passive healing from a pet with Cardia, a tool that you can place on the tank and forget if you wish, and then all of your attacks will automatically do the healing. Alternatively, you can move around Cardia as an ability throughout a fight to make sure it is always situated on someone that benefits from the healing. When used optimally so every heal is useful and you attack all the time, Cardia tends to outperform the Scholar's Fairy. In terms of attack rotation, the Sage is a lot closer to White Mage in playstyle, where you replace both Presence of Mind and Afflatus Misery with the generally helpful Phlegma, which has the strange property that it requires you to get a bit closer to enemies. For moving a lot, Toxicon requires you to apply single target shields that get spent, which makes it unreliable. However, as the shield applying versions of spells in the Sage's toolkit are instant compared to the Scholar's casted versions, the Sage can opt to apply shields while running if they have to. Finally, Dyscrasia being a slightly weaker version of Art of War makes the AoE gameplay of the Sage very similar to the Scholar. The main optimization for the Sage being in planning to use your Phlegma around everyone else's raid cooldowns. And since this particular spell has an awkward 45-second charge time, this can require some finesse to make happen. For healing, the Sage passively recovers their secondary resource instead of getting them in sets of 3 like the Scholar, and also, differently, does not have an ability to sacrifice them for damage. In fact, as the MP recovery from this resource is only retrieved when the resource is spent, if your raid is not taking much damage, you may need to toss these resources for MP recovery or risk running out of MP. Fortunately, similar to the Scholar, the Sage has some tools that are so helpful that you can almost never go wrong casting them. Caracol, functioning as an even easier to use version of Scholar's Sacred Soil, and Taurocol, the Sage's excogitation equivalent. Although completely different, both serve as tools that are just always helpful. Caracol for the raid, Taurocol for the tank, or Ixocol for even more raid healing. For easier content above level 78, the Sage can at times get away with healing with just Cardia and Caracol. But even so, the Sage has a vast amount of tools, including ability-based barriers, as well as the biggest single cast raid-wide heal in the game with Noima, the Laser Beam. Sage's toolkit is so strong in a dungeon environment that in most situations it can quite literally autopilot using a set sequence of healing abilities every single pull with no further thinking, regardless of what tank you have. In a raid environment, on the other hand, you may find this easily accessible toolkit almost like a curse more than a blessing, as it is possible your co-healers may rely heavily on your healing abilities to avoid having to rely on their stronger healing spells. In content where you are paired with another barrier healer, you are also even less likely to be able to rely on Toxicon, since you need to have your barrier broken by damage and your co-healer's shields can override yours. To round up this comparison, each healer of course has some specific draw to play it. If you like minor management of a passive healing component and sort of prefer to attack more than heal, then both Scholar and Sage each have their own reasons to be played. If you on the other hand prefer to have full control yourself, then White Mage stands above all the others. And if you like randomness and support classes in general, then Astrologian is unbeatable. For a new player picking up their first healer, I will always recommend playing White Mage first, as its straightforward toolkit makes it easier to understand. Once you have learned the basics of healing, I do very much recommend Sage as the easiest, in my opinion, of all the healers to play. So much so that it is the healer I prominently display in my recently released guide on simple jobs to play. On the other hand, I would highly advise against playing Astrologian as your first healer. Scholar is somewhere in the middle, as due to the simplification of the pet management over the years, it has become easier to deal with. Choose the healer that you enjoy the most, for all of them are viable in all content. Even if one does ever so slightly more DPS or healing than the others, they are all perfectly capable of doing what needs to be done. And that leads us to the ending of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this comparison or even found it funny or interesting, please consider leaving a like. You can also subscribe and heal the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And make sure to let me know in the comments which healer is your favorite. Fun fact, before Stormblood, healers' attacks scaled with intelligence instead of mind, and so you had to use the ability Cleric Stance to swap your mind to intelligence, making most of your healing worthless, but making your damage stronger. In addition to this, you needed a hit chance based stat to make sure your attacks didn't miss. which was later replaced with the directed stat we have today. Perhaps this explains why the summoner's physics spell still scales with mine to this day?